Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video and talk about this subject that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video, I believe, by a YouTube channel known as Sean Zittel. I believe spelled Sean for Sean, and Zittel, I believe, Zittel. May even put his channel name down in the description box below. But for those of you that I believe are familiar with FightHype.com, the YouTube channel, you'll see him every once in a while interviewing certain fighters or interviewing certain commentators. And, he interviewed Mr. Jim Lampley, one of the more colorful commentators, I believe, of course, within that of boxing history. And someone, of course, to where if you grew up with HBO boxing, kind of like how I did in the early to mid 2010s, of course, he was on there even way longer before that, I believe. But that's when I started first getting into sports because I was a mid, age teenager. But anyways, when it comes down to it, Sean Zittel interviewed that of Jim Lampley after the Canelo Alvarez versus Jaime Munguia performance. And the question is now about Mr. Canelo Alvarez is, first of all, how much time does he really have left? And for those of you that have, listened to my most recent videos, I already have given that answer, at least from my perspective. I believe that Canelo Alvarez maybe has about 1 or 2 more years. And it isn't that he's still not a great fighter, but I just think that it's clear that he's been aging progressively, a little bit more slowly with each and every single fight. And I think that had this Canelo Alvarez had this Canelo been the same Canelo from about 4 years ago, the one that had fought Caleb Plant and was able to unify that weight class, I think more than likely that he probably would have stopped at a Jaime Munguia. But we'll talk about that as it goes along. But of course, the question also is about Mr. Canelo Alvarez, and I've kind of talked about this in discussions in the past. Where does Canelo Alvarez really rank in terms of the all-time greats? And the bigger question is, of course, because Canelo Alvarez is a Mexican fighter, he's from Jalisco, Mexico, I believe. The question is that where does he rank in terms of the all-time Mexican greats? Where does he rank there with Julio Cesar Chavez Sr.? Where does he rank with Juan Manuel Marquez? Salvador Sanchez, Ricardo Lopez, Marco Antonio Barrera, Eric Morales, and I'm sure the list goes on and on and on and on, So the question is that how great is Canelo Alvarez, and is he debatably the greatest Mexican fighter ever? But anyways, we'll talk about that, and I thought that it was an interesting discussion, as well as Jim Lampley's breakdown of the Canelo Alvarez versus Jaime Munguia fight. Let's get into it.
All right, the legend in the flesh joins us again, my man Jim Lampley. Jim, I thoroughly enjoyed it, from Canelo. Did you enjoy the fight? What did you think of Canelo's performance?
Well, I thought the first 4 or 5 rounds were thrilling because you got the impression in the first 4 or 5 rounds that Jaime Munguia had a game plan. He certainly had the courage. He had the devotion to the task that it might have taken to ultimately have a chance to win the fight. But as the fight went on, it became clear that he didn't really have the pop necessary to dent the greatest chin in the sport, Canelo Alvarez. And
well, I'm not gonna 100% agree with that, Mr. Jim Lampley. I don't think that it would be fair to state that Jaime Munguia doesn't have the pop to possibly hurt, quote unquote, the greatest chin in the sport. And when Jim Lampley says that, by the way, the greatest chin within all the sport, usually greatest, of course, means that we're talking about all time. So if someone says that, like when Dante's Boxing Nation, when he says that, Devin Haney and Gervonta Tank Davis and, those guys, they're the Michael Jordan of the sport. I never really liked that quote because to me, that would be trying to allege that those guys are debatably the greatest fighters of all time. When you talk about a Michael Jordan of the sport, now, of course, I don't think he meant it in that right necessarily or that type of, way. I think he just meant that they're the best, of course, for boxing, at the current moment in time or of their era. But, whenever you compare someone to, say, Tom Brady, Wayne Gretzky, overall, Michael Jordan, other guys like that, Muhammad Ali, Floyd Mayweather, whoever else you want to compare him to, Djokovic, whatever sport you get into. You have to wait till those guys are super duper accomplished, before you kind of compare them with guys like that. At least when you start talking about them being the Michael Jordan of the whole entire sport. But I understand where Dante is coming from that perspective. But anyways, when we actually talk about Canelo Alvarez, when you talk about, his resume, he's an all-time great fighter. But to be quite honest with you, when Jim Lampley says that Canelo Alvarez might have the greatest chin in all the sport of boxing, To be quite honest with you, I may have to agree with that. Canelo Alvarez has never been knocked down once throughout his whole entire career, I believe. I think he's only ever even been close to being knocked down one time in his career, and that was against Jose Cotto, I believe, one of Miguel Cotto's brothers, I believe, or his older brother, who also had participated in boxing. Canelo, of course, was able to come back and win that fight, I believe, by a TKO, and that was when he was relatively young. I think that was when I'm not sure how old he would have been. I think that he may have even been about 21 to 22 in that fight. I'm not really sure, but that was definitely a while ago, But other than that, to be quite honest with you, maybe in this Gennady Golovkin rematch where Golovkin hit him with a great, right hand, I believe, like a great right uppercut. I seen Canelo Alvarez a little bit staggered and kind of wobbly a little bit, but other than that, to be quite honest with you, I've never really seen Canelo Alvarez in serious trouble. Even against Dimitri Bivol, even against Gennady Golovkin, even against Danny Jacobs, Araceli Lara, Jaime Munguia. Like, it literally doesn't matter who Canelo Alvarez has gotten in the ring with. He probably, out of any other all-time great fighter that's accomplished what he has accomplished, he probably has the greatest chin that I've personally ever seen. Even greater than certain fighters like Floyd Mayweather of his era, even greater than other certain fighters overall, that maybe I'm not thinking of. The three fighters to where you're talking about the greatest chins that I've seen probably would really be the three middleweight fighters that I'm aware of, which would be Canelo Alvarez, Marvin Hagler, and also that of Gennady Triple G Golovkin. When you talk about all those guys at their peak, it's really hard to hurt those guys. Like, you have to really, really, really try to rock those guys, overall to really massively hurt them. Canelo Alvarez, I mean, he might, I'll say that Gennady Golovkin at his peak may have a better chin, but Canelo Alvarez, like his chin is absolutely phenomenal. Like, he might have, once again, for what he's accomplished, he might have the greatest chin that I've personally ever seen.
He didn't understand the necessary devotion to body punching that might have given him a chance. And he got caught too many times by one of the sport's best counterpunchers. And Canelo's not just a counterpuncher, he's a power counterpuncher. So,
agreed. Canelo Alvarez also really is a boxer puncher. That's really what Canelo Alvarez is. Canelo Alvarez is a fantastic fighter. All-time great fighter.
The excitement of the first few rounds evaporated as we got to the middle of the fight and then went onward, and the crowd ultimately realized that the Canelo Alvarez who survived Gennady Golovkin twice simply has too much wherewithal for young Jaime Munguia to have had a chance.
That leads into my next question. You called his...
Canelo Alvarez is going to be one of those fighters to where even at this point in time in his career, where in my view you can tell that he's clearly slowed compared to what he was, or he's not quite as fast, he's not quite as sharp as what he once was. It's still going to take a fighter like a Dimitri Bivol or an Artur Beterbiev or potentially a David Benavidez, someone who's a decent amount bigger than him and someone that also has, A-grade level talent. It's going to take one of those fighters to really defeat Canelo Alvarez, possibly thoroughly, because Canelo Alvarez is just so greatly skilled. He's an all-time great fighter. He's an excellent counterpuncher. He can fight a little bit in all ranges. I would state that he's probably not quite as great on the back foot at times overall as what he is on the front foot, or within the mid-range, but he still can fight decently well. And with his backs up against the ropes, Canelo Alvarez can fight extraordinarily well in that range. Like for those of you that remember the James Kirkland fight where Kirkland was actually, he was pressuring Canelo Alvarez quite a bit, but Canelo, every time he knocked him down, it was pretty much when his back was up against the ropes. So Canelo, you have to watch out when his back is up against the ropes, because people a lot of the times think he's just super vulnerable there. Canelo Alvarez is an excellent counterpuncher on the back foot, on the front foot, within the mid-range, with his back up against the ropes. Canelo Alvarez can pretty much do it all.
Rematch with Golovkin here when he won that great fight. What would you compare him now compared to that moment 5 or 6 years ago? Is he still everything he was that night, or has he lessened a little bit? How do you see him, Jim?
I don't think he's diminished at all. I think he's still Canelo Alvarez. And I think...
Well, he's still Canelo Alvarez, but in terms of, overall being a diminished fighter, I don't think that I can agree that Canelo Alvarez hasn't diminished at all. I think that, to be honest with you, the last great performance that I've seen Canelo Alvarez in, when I thought that I seen him at his absolute peak, was against Caleb Plant. Now, he still looked great here. He still looked like a fighter that still could put it on someone and is going to beat like 95% of fighters out there, especially if they're his own same size, But at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez did not come across to me as a guy that in this fight was at his absolute peak. So to state that, in my view, that he's just not diminished at all, that's not what I seen. Like I said yesterday in this fight, Canelo Alvarez, I stated in my video that I thought that he looked about 40 years old, and maybe 40 years old, maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration, but, he looked, about 37 years old. Like I said, Canelo Alvarez has kind of looked like a 37-year-old in that of boxing, really for his past few fights. I don't think he looked that good against John Ryder. I thought against Jamel Charlo, of course, he looked good, but I was expecting that because, like I've already stated, Jamel Charlo, he was being majorly hyped up, especially by the LDBC and new media, as this potential top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. No one ever was going to favor him over Spence, Crawford, or Canelo. It was never going to happen. And even had you put Jamel Charlo in the ring against Janibek, he would have lost every single one of those fights. And Jamel Charlo, in my view, is a A- level fighter. He's a decent boxer, but he's a dude that probably should be fighting at 160 pounds. And I think that, of course, it's great that he was unified, but he was really unified in a division to where it really was not that strong. And he still ended up losing to Tony Harrison within one of those fights. And on top of that, he should have lost that first Brian Castano fight. So I pretty much expected that from Jamel Charlo. And on top of that, I could tell that he was afraid of Canelo Alvarez. Like, he was completely scared shitless, in that Canelo Alvarez fight. When it comes down to, like, he he was done. There was no way overall he was going to win that fight. He was just there for a payday.
That, we can talk about his counterpunching skill. We can talk about his strength and punching power. But at the end of the day, the real basis of his greatness is his punch resistance. You can't hurt him.
Well, the real base of Canelo Alvarez's greatness is his great all-around game. When you talk about Canelo Alvarez, there's just really not a whole lot of categories that aren't A-grade or that are not superb. When you talk about his punching power, it's elite, it's superb. When you talk about his hand speed, at least overall, at his best, it's superb. When you talk about his counterpunching ability, it's superb. When you talk about his pull counters, it's superb. When you talk about, overall, his ability to roll with punches, and feints, and parry certain shots, and his level of defense, which has improved immensely over the past several years. All of those categories are superb. The only 2 categories where Canelo Alvarez is not really 10 out of 10 in is probably his feet, because they can be a bit slow, and his stamina. Those are pretty much the only 2 categories. Every other category, Canelo Alvarez basically has an A+ in. And that's what makes Canelo Alvarez such a hard fighter to beat.
You can't knock him down. I called about a dozen years ago the one knockdown in his whole career, and that was a kind of a freaky moment when Jose Cotto caught him.
Well, I don't believe that was counted as a knockdown. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't think it was called a knockdown. Maybe it was, because Canelo Alvarez, I believe at the end of the day, he's never touched the canvas. But maybe it was counted as a knockdown because Canelo Alvarez, he was getting hurt in the corner, and, maybe they, were counting, because they wanted, to let the fight go on a bit longer. Maybe it was counted as a knockdown, but I don't personally remember it being counted as a knockdown. But if I'm wrong about that, someone correct me.
Knocked him back into the ropes, and the ropes held him up, and it was ruled a knockdown. He's never been on his back. He's never been on the canvas. And as long as you can't get him off his feet, he's in position to line you up and keep landing those thudding counter shots that ultimately are just too discouraging for people to have a chance. So, who can beat him? It's the obvious question. Can he make the David Benavidez fight? And can he, at his age, take David Benavidez' punch? I think Benavidez, if he gets the fight, will be the largest puncher ever to have been in the ring with him. I think he's a bigger puncher than Golovkin.
I'm not so sure about that. I've always stated this about David Benavidez. I think that his power is a little bit overrated. I think that, his power, of course, is very good, and I think it's on the A-grade level. But I've just never seen David Benavidez as this massive one-shot knockout guy. Like, if I was going to compare him to a fighter, I don't really know which boxer I would necessarily compare him to. But in my view, like a very good comparison for David Benavidez would be that of Max Holloway. When you talk about his power level comparison, where Max Holloway, he's not a guy that really usually has one-shot knockout power. It isn't like he can't potentially do it, especially if he hits you with the right shot. But Max Holloway is not usually going to stop someone with just one good shot, especially if they're an elite level caliber fighter. He has to get you with volume. He has to get you with an accumulative amount of time with certain shots. David Benavidez' threat, it's not really, the complete amount of power that he carries in his hands. Now, does he have power? Yes, of course. And he should, because the man, overall is 6'2", the rehydrates probably at over 200 pounds. So, of course, you should carry some sort of power at 168 pounds. And that's not me stating, once again, that he does not have decent power. I'm sure he's going to have decent power even at the 175-pound weight class and potentially at 200 pounds at the cruiserweight class. Of course, if he's able to still be successful in both of those weight classes against the creme de la creme of those divisions. But at the end of the day, David Benavidez is not a guy that really has this one-shot knockout power. I've never seen David Benavidez in a fight where I said, wow, like when he hit him with that punch, that damn near knocked him out. Canelo Alvarez and Gennady Golovkin, they have that type of power to where if they hit you with a good shot, at least at their absolute peak, they can, they have like bone crushing power. David Benavidez is just a level below those guys. But, to say that David Benavidez is an even more powerful puncher than Golovkin, I mean, you may never know, but if he's a more powerful puncher than Golovkin, it's because, he'd probably be about 30 pounds heavier than Golovkin. That's probably, to be quite honest with you, really about the only reason. I don't think it would be any other reason. Gennady Golovkin, like, people don't understand how hard of a puncher Gennady Golovkin was. And this is also another reason, why Canelo Alvarez, in my view, why I also hold him in such high regard, because Canelo was actually able to beat, in my view, in the rematch against Gennady Golovkin, someone that not only probably had the best power of his generation for any pound-for-pound fighter, of his generation, but also probably the best chin overall of his generation. And on top of that, he was very technically sound. Now, you can state, of course, there were certain holes in his game, maybe like not the best head movement at times, not always the quickest feet or, best on the back foot, but he had very good footwork. He was a great counter puncher. He had good body work, good head work. It's just that Canelo Alvarez ended up being the superior fighter, at least in the second match. Now, I thought that he lost the first one clearly, but the second one, I thought that Canelo Alvarez just pulled through, and this is why whenever there's comparisons made to Canelo and Oscar De La Hoya, for example, like, I never really got those comparisons, because I have certain people that say, oh, well, you grew up on Canelo, I grew up on Oscar De La Hoya, and De La Hoya was 20 times better than Canelo Alvarez. No, Oscar De La Hoya was not 20 times better than Canelo. In fact, to be quite honest with you, he was not better than Canelo Alvarez whatsoever. Because Canelo Alvarez, he can fight guys that have more power than him, that are lengthier than him, that are taller than him, that are a weight class bigger than him, sometimes even a weight class and a half bigger than him, and he can still sometimes thoroughly outbox those guys or at least beat those guys. If you put Oscar De La Hoya in the ring against guys that are A-grade level fighters, that are pretty much the same size as him or lengthier than him, like if he got in the ring overall with his version potentially of Danny Jacobs or Gennady Golovkin or some of those other guys, I'm not sure if Oscar would have beat any of those guys. Oscar overall was a great fighter, but when we really take a look at it, how many big fights once Oscar started moving up the weight classes, how many big fights did he really win? Like a lot of people, they state, oh, well, Oscar beat Chavez Sr. and, he beat Pernell Sweet Whitaker, who are two of the greatest fighters of all time. And that's very true, but you should have beat those fighters because not only did you have youth on your side, overall, but you had the major size advantage, like not even just in terms of the weight. Like Canelo Alvarez, I mean, he definitely had the weight over Floyd Mayweather when they fought, but it's like at least Floyd Mayweather Jr. could somewhat compete in terms of the reach without a Canelo. Like he had a longer reach than Canelo Alvarez. Oscar De La Hoya was like 5'11" with like a 74 to 76 arm reach. And he was fighting guys that probably should have been 135 to 140 pounders, and that of Chavez Sr. and Pernell Sweet Whitaker. That's why Oscar De La Hoya, he's an all-time great fighter. Don't get it twisted. But in my view, he's been a little bit overrated within that of history because people always love to bring up his wins at 135 and, a little bit. But to be honest with you, De La Hoya really should have been at 147 pounds, really minimum. He was able to get away with it early on in his career because he hadn't grown into his body fully yet. But that's why I always say that I have to wait to see how great a fighter actually is when they finally start fighting people their own same size. Canelo Alvarez, when he fights people even a little bit bigger than him, he can still beat those guys, even if they're A-grade level fighters. Whether it be Caleb Plant, Danny Jacobs, even if we want to count Sergey Kovalev, Callum Smith, How many fighters have you really seen Oscar De La Hoya in the ring with to where they were lengthier than him, bigger than him, and they were clear A-grade level fighters, and he was actually able to beat them? Because to be quite honest with you, almost every single time he was in an A-grade level fight, overall to where they were near his own same dimensions and they were a potential top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, he pretty much got beat every single time. Whether it be Felix Tito Trinidad, whether overall it be, what was his name, Sugar Shane Mosley in the first fight, a fight that he never should have lost if he really was, on that same level, especially with Mosley moving up 2 weight classes. Of course, I thought Oscar won the rematch to be fair, but, overall that does have to be in there. And keep in mind that Sugar Shane Mosley, A-grade level fighter, but he's not quite on the same level for, say, as like a Mayweather or a Canelo in terms of boxing ability, even as a Miguel Cotto in my view. But, when it comes down to it, and he also lost, I believe, to Floyd Mayweather Jr. later on. Now, of course, he gave Floyd a much greater fight than what Canelo Alvarez did. But at the end of the day, once again, Canelo, in my view, when you compare him and Oscar De La Hoya, it's really just not any comparison in my view. Because when you talk about the skill set, I just think that Canelo pretty much beats him in every single category. I think that the only categories that Oscar really beats Canelo Alvarez in, even at his absolute peak, is going to be speed, hand speed, and foot movement and footwork. And to be honest with you, I think that that's really about it. I don't think that he beats Canelo Alvarez in power, for his weight class. I don't think that he beats him in head movement. He definitely doesn't beat him in head movement. He doesn't beat him in defense. He doesn't beat him in chin. He doesn't beat him in punching power, Maybe he'd have more stamina than Canelo Alvarez as well. I'd have to see about that, because I don't think I've seen Oscar De La Hoya get super tired throughout a lot of fights. But other than that, there's just not a whole lot of other advantages that he would have, So it is what it is.
And that's saying a lot. So I think that at the end of the day, if Canelo wants to put one more meaningful crowning achievement on his career, to put his accomplishments so far up that you certainly have to consider calling him the greatest Mexican fighter ever. And I don't know if there's a national identity anywhere in the sport that's more meaningful than that. Canelo can take on...
Well, because of the Mexican pride, of course, it would mean a lot. But of course, something that would potentially be something even bigger is, of course, the greatest American fighter of all time. Because when you talk about, debatably the greatest fighters of all time, they usually have been that of USA boxers. Whether you talk about Ali, Floyd Mayweather, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roy Jones Jr., Rocky Marciano, I'm trying to think of some other ones. Potentially Marvin Hagler, even though he only kind of fought in one weight class, so that's up to you. There's a certain amount of other ones, but let me tell you what, there is some Mexican fighters in the greatest of all time conversation, or at least very near close to it, like Chavez Sr. A lot of people, of course, also put Salvador Sanchez within that conversation, but we're going to talk about that, within the next couple minutes.
And beat a puncher like Benavidez after everything he's done up to this point. I'm not a scholar of Mexican boxing, but I know a lot. And I would put him ahead of all the great Mexican fighters I call, including Julio Cesar Chavez, including Marco Antonio Barrera, including Eric Morales. There are others that I could put on the list. But, it's an amazing...
And Jim Lampley, I believe, just stated that he would put Canelo Alvarez above all those fighters. And do I agree with him? Yes, I do. In my personal view, is Canelo Alvarez the greatest Mexican fighter of all time? I mean, to me, there's really only one argument when you talk about, who could potentially compete with Canelo in terms of the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. I think that it's either him or Chavez Sr. I just don't think that there's any other debates other than that for the greatest Mexican fighters of all time. Now, of course, Roberto Duran, I believe that he was half Mexican. I believe that his father was a Mexican-American man, I believe, actually. If I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. But, of course, he was from Panama. So I don't really count him as Mexican, but in terms of the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, it's either going to fall between Canelo Alvarez or Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. Those are the only two Mexican fighters or Mexican-American fighters that I really consider in that conversation. Salvador Sanchez, of course, all-time great fighter. And, of course, a lot of people state that, they believe that Sanchez was more talented and more skilled than both of those boxers. And that may be so. But, we don't keep the standards for a lot of other fighters that, win. They only win within that of one weight class, and only have a certain amount of title defenses, like only several title defenses. A lot of the times we don't call those fighters the greatest of all time. So, at the end of the day, I don't think that I can give Salvador Sanchez that same treatment. It is what it is. Salvador Sanchez, overall is a great fighter, one of the greatest in my view ever, and he's still pretty high on my list. But when you talk about him, he only was a champion within one weight class, and unfortunately, he did pass away a little bit early on. So I just don't think that I can put him over someone like that of a Canelo or a Julio Cesar Chavez, someone who's just more accomplished. It is what it is. And when you talk about Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales, I mean, you got guys out here, like I review Boxing Ego, and he's like, oh, I can't put Canelo, over Barrera and Eric Morales because of blah, 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 and all this other stuff because of the PEDs, and, he picks his fights and blah, blah, all this other shit. And if you want to mention the PEDs, that's up to you. That to me is somewhat of a respectable argument if you're going to be consistent with that. But the thing is that people always love to use the steroid excuse, overall, which isn't completely an excuse or an invalid excuse because, of course, PEDs help your performance. But the reason why it's not as big of a deal to me, because I believe that the majority of these guys are on something anyway. So to me, it just is what it is. But a lot of people love to use the steroid thing, with certain fighters that they don't like. And then when it comes to fighters that they do like, it never gets mentioned. Like Sugar Shane Mosley or, someone else. They'll mention it with their favorite fighters, or excuse me, they'll mention it with the fighters that they love to tear down or that they try to discredit, but they won't mention it with other all-time great fighters. Like if you take a look at any of these LDBC or new media channels, do you think that they ever bring up the fact that Shane Mosley was on steroids? It never comes up, so it is what it is. So, you can maybe state that, but in terms of the greatness, in terms of the biggest fights, you can't ever put Marco Antonio Barrera or Eric Morales over Canelo because they just didn't win enough of their big fights. It is what it is. Eric Morales ended up losing the trilogy to Marco Antonio Barrera. He lost the most important trilogy of his time, and he also lost the trilogy to Manny Pacquiao. Now, of course, he beat that of Manny Pacquiao, but I think that in the first fight that he beat a version of Manny Pacquiao that, in my view, was still a little bit too wild. And once Manny Pacquiao improved as a fighter, in the other two fights, they really weren't even competitive. Manny Pacquiao pretty much ran right through him. And with Marco Antonio Barrera, it was never even competitive. Manny Pacquiao chewed that dude up. He put him through a meat grinder. So in my view, you can't really compare those two fighters to Canelo. Now, Marquez, I could potentially see, overall someone that, overall, I could potentially see how you would put Marquez, maybe right there with Canelo or above him. But in my view, Marquez wouldn't be there either. And the reason why is because, in my view, you would have to debatably be the best fighter of your generation or pretty damn close to it, overall, at least for a certain amount of time. You can never debate that Juan Manuel Marquez was ever the best fighter of his time. Now, the best Mexican fighter, yes. But when you talk about Chavez Sr., when you talk about Canelo, like those guys were actually debated as the best and the greatest of their era for a certain amount of time. Not just overall certain weight classes, or not just overall, a guy that lost to Mayweather and then Pacquiao, and then a couple of other fighters, So Canelo Alvarez, when it comes down to it, no, he has to also be considered greater than Juan Manuel Marquez. It is what it is. And some people might say, well, Marquez has a great win over Pacquiao. Is that debatably, isn't that debatably a bigger win than any of the wins in Canelo's career? And we can go with that argument if you want to. But if we're also going to talk about that, Canelo only has 2 official losses in his career. He only has 1 loss to Floyd Mayweather Jr., who is the greatest fighter probably within the past 20 plus years, at the very least. Marquez probably looked even worse against that of Floyd Mayweather Jr. when it came down to it. Now, of course, to be fair, Canelo was 20 pounds bigger than Mayweather, so someone should say, well, I don't know how that really helps your case. But that also being said, Juan Manuel Marquez didn't just end up losing to Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather Jr. He also ended up losing to other certain fighters. He ended up losing to Timothy Bradley, I believe, right after the Manny Pacquiao knockout. And he ended up losing some other fights in his career as well. So at the end of the day, it isn't like Juan Manuel Marquez's losses were just overall to Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather Jr. And even with that point, it really wouldn't matter much because Canelo was looked at a time as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, and he's debatably the greatest of his generation. If you were to talk about who is the most accomplished, who is the greatest, even potentially the most skilled out of any other fighter within the past 10 years, you could debate Canelo Alvarez. And I'm talking about the post-Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Manny Pacquiao era. That's what I'm talking about. So when you compare him to his peers, Vasily Lomachenko, Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk, Terrence Bud Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., Devin Haney or Shakur Stevenson. I mean, those guys are probably a part of the new generation, so I don't know if I really count those guys. But, some of the other guys, Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, Sergey Kovalev, Artur Beterbiev, all those other guys, Canelo would probably be above them. So it just is what it is.
Distinction if he gets to the point where we can say unequivocally, yes, he's earned it, and I think he wants that.
What about as of tonight? No Benavidez fight withstanding. Is he greater? I mean, you call these guys at the peak of their powers. Barrera, Morales, Marquez. Is he better than them? Or is he,
He's as exciting as them now. There was a time.
And to answer that question, yes, Canelo Alvarez is better than Marquez, Marco Antonio Barrera, and Eric Morales. Yes, he's better than all those fighters.
And when I did not think
greater and better than all those fighters.
He was as, sort of blood racingly exciting as some of those guys were. He's as exciting as them now because now you're watching the continuation of a genuinely great career.
Yeah.
I mean, 2 losses. And both of them to not good boxers, great boxers.
Agreed, sir. Thank you. The only 2 losses in Canelo Alvarez's career, at least officially. I'll say 3 losses because I thought that he should have lost the first Gennady Golovkin fight. So let's just say the 3 losses because I already know someone's going to come down in the comment section and say, well, Canelo really should have like 17 losses on his resume. So there's going to be someone like that. The second Gennady Golovkin fight, I thought Canelo just pulled out. And in the Lara fight, it was a fight that could have won either way. So I don't just not count those wins just because those fights were super close. Because we don't do that with other fighters. We don't do it with Sugar Ray Leonard against Marvin Hagler. When a bunch of people thought that it was controversial. We don't do it with Muhammad Ali, with Ken Norton. We don't do it overall, with certain other fights when it comes down to it. So why are we only putting this standard overall on certain fighters?
Floyd Mayweather and Dimitri Bivol.
Yes, agreed. All-time great talents and great boxers. Floyd Mayweather Jr., who probably is the greatest fighter at the very least of the past 20 years, when it comes down to it, 25 plus years. And then when it comes to Dimitri Bivol, a guy that was probably about 2 weight classes bigger than Canelo Alvarez, and a dude that is one of the top 10 pound-for-pound potential fighters, even before Canelo Alvarez ended up losing to him. Like, Bivol was already on the borderline of being a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter, but once he beat Canelo, then he got major exposure. I've always told people this, Bivol is not anything to mess around with, man. That dude can box.
What does that mean? It means no Mexican fighter has beaten him. No Mexican-American fighter has beaten him.
Well, I think that the better point to ask Jim Lampley is that how many big fights in Canelo Alvarez's career has he won? And how many weight classes has he done it around? Because when we talk about Canelo Alvarez's weight classes, how many great or talented Mexican fighters really was there? Jaime Munguia, of course. I guess Chavez Jr., but I really don't know if you would count that as an elite win. I would count it probably as a B grade win. But, at the end of the day, once again, how many great Mexican fighters is there really, debated overall around his weight classes? And now, of course, there's David Benavidez, but I mean, other than that, who really has been there? The fighters that have really been around his weight classes have been guys like Lara, Trout, Cotto, Golovkin, Andrade, the Charlo brothers, Danny Jacobs, Saunders, Caleb Plant, Smith, those guys. So the majority of the great fighters in Canelo Alvarez's career within his weight classes, they weren't usually Mexican.
That's what matters most to his audience. They can deal with, a great Russian technician beat him, and, the ultimate sort of knockout-proof stylist beat him. We get that. They want to see him go in and fight against other guys who are going to come at him the way Munguia came at him tonight and wind up besting them with his chin and his counter-punching capability. This was classic Canelo. Everything that makes him great was visible in the ring tonight. I love Munguia. He gave it everything. I said on ppv.com, Munguia was brave, Munguia was beautiful, the crowd loved him, and he was another Canelo victim.
I'll leave you with this, Jim. Larry, he would say, gun to my head, and then he'd make his pick, right? So in the words of Larry Merchant, gun to your head, Canelo or Benavidez.
Wow. Wow. Let's see the circumstances of how the fight is made, where it's going to take place, all that kind of stuff. I don't want to make a pick.
Let me comment on this really quickly. Because Dante's Boxing Nation, for example, he always tries to put this narrative out there about how Canelo Alvarez, oh, it shows how limited of a fighter that he is, that so many people are actually picking Terrence Bud Crawford to beat Canelo Alvarez. It just shows you how average of a fighter he actually is. All this sort of stuff, when really, to be quite honest with you, I really don't know how many boxers are really picking Crawford. And I mean, like, this always happens with every single one of those fights. There's always a bunch of boxers or coaches that pick Mikey Garcia, to beat Errol Spence, or Kell Brook to beat Golovkin, or, overall someone to beat the guy that's coming up 2 weight classes, because they try to sound smarter than what they actually are, and they want to appear to be a genius if their predictions ends up, coming out correct, but, I'm not really sure how many people are actually really legitly picking Terrence Bud Crawford to beat Canelo. Now, I think that, maybe a certain amount are. But keep in mind also that Canelo Alvarez, and you never hear Dante's Boxing Nation make this point, that David Benavidez would be a legitimate 20-plus pounds over Canelo Alvarez, a guy that would be several inches taller than him, at least 3 inches lengthier than him in terms of the reach, and a guy overall that would basically be a light heavyweight fighter when Canelo really is more of a natural middleweight. I mean, David Benavidez might even be a cruiserweight fighter, but a lot of people are stating, you know what? I think that Canelo Alvarez could potentially win that fight, or that it's a 50-50 level fight. You never hear that out of Dante's Boxing Nation's mouth or some of these other guys about, what does that say about Canelo? But anyway.
Right now, I'm the world's biggest David Benavidez admirer, but I'm also the world's biggest Canelo Alvarez admirer. So let's just say this. They are 2 tremendously talented fighters. One of them may be reaching his peak right now. The other one is probably a tiny bit beyond his peak, but not far enough beyond his peak that you could honestly say he slipped. He was great.
I don't agree with that. I think that Canelo Alvarez has lost at least 1 step. I think that he's slower. I don't think that he's quite as quick to the punch. He's still going to beat 95% of the fighters out there. But, had this been Canelo, for example, from the Caleb Plant fight, he probably would have stopped Munguia. I think that, to be quite honest with you, had it been from the Canelo from 3 or 4 years ago, whenever he fought Caleb Plant and those guys, I think that he would have stopped his last 3 opponents. Because to be honest with you, in my view, he should have been able to stop John Ryder. He should have been able to stop Jamel Charlo. And he also should have been able to stop that Jaime Munguia. Jamel Charlo maybe not, because Jamel was basically just running his ass off the whole entire fight. He knew damn well he wasn't going to beat Canelo Alvarez. He just overall basically did a jogging contest, in that ring to get millions of dollars. That's really all he did, which is exactly what I predicted, because you could tell that Jamel Charlo, that, he knew that this was going to be his cash out. He was done after that.
Tonight, he had to be great tonight to put distance between himself and a hungry, skilled, good young fighter who tried as hard as he could.
Who was at least a weight class bigger than him. Like, this is what I say, like, Jaime Munguia at the very least is like a real 168 pounder. When you take a look at Canelo, like, he's a bit thicker, compared to some other, like, 160 pounders. Canelo's not a natural 168 pounder. Munguia is a dude that is a 168 pounder. And Benavidez, and he looked huge compared to Canelo Alvarez. Benavidez is even bigger than what Jaime Munguia is.
But he beat him. And he proved once again that...
But to talk about that power comparison really quickly, because a lot of people are talking about, well, he didn't have enough pop, or some people are stating that, and some people are stating, well, I personally believe that Munguia has more pop in his punches than David Benavidez. I'm not really quite sure who has more power. Jaime Munguia might have more power. I'm not sure, but to be fair, he also has been in the ring against smaller fighters. So I don't really know exactly who would have more pop in his punches, but what I'll state is this. In my view, it's at least about on the same level playing field. It could be in the edge of Munguia, but I'm not quite sure. It could be in the edge of either fighter, but if either fighter has the advantage, it's not by much. And once again, Benavidez has great power, and I think that he would be more of a threat to Canelo just because of his pure size, and on top of that, because overall David Benavidez is relentless with his style. But it would be interesting to see if Canelo Alvarez would be able to beat Benavidez at this point, because I think that he's clearly aged as a fighter. I think he's a lot slower than what he once was. And I think that he's a guy that, clearly is showing signs of reducing, in terms of his ability, or at least, slipping a little bit. I don't think that, of course, he's fallen off the cliff. But Canelo Alvarez right now, like, he kind of looks overall, like one of those NBA players or one of those NFL football players, to where they're still a threat, but you can tell that, the time is almost coming up for them. Kind of like, Tom Brady, in the season a couple of years ago, when he lost to the LA Rams, I believe, in the second round, I believe, or the third round, against Matthew Stafford and the LA Rams. Like, Tom Brady still looked very good, but you could tell that the time was very near coming to an end.
In circumstances where people are trying to find a way to pick against him, he wins. And he wins because, again, you can't knock him down. You can't ruffle him. You can't disturb that calm, methodical, go-forward demeanor that he has and that he's always had.
Yeah, his composure was crazy tonight. Yeah. But thank you so much, Jim. Thanks for your time. Thank you, Jim.
My privilege.
Guys, Mother's Day is coming.
But anyways, that's pretty much about it for this video. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. But if you were going to ask me, do I believe that Canelo is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time? I think that is very highly debatable. Like I said, it comes between two fighters, either Canelo or Chavez Sr. And if we're really going to go there might be certain things that Canelo can do in the ring that Chavez Sr. cannot do. Canelo Alvarez, like I stated, for a dude that's 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach, the fact that, and of course he's decently girthy, like he's not a guy that, is light in the ass or anything. But the fact that he's still been able to beat fighters like Golovkin, Danny Jacobs, Caleb Plant, Jaime Munguia, overall, some other guys, Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, certain guys like that, all fighters that would probably be a little bit bigger than him. It goes to show you once again that Canelo Alvarez, that, how great of a fighter he actually is, but it is what it is. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for the video today. But to answer the question about, is Canelo the greatest Mexican fighter of all time? He would probably have my vote, but if someone said Chavez Sr., I would understand. Marco Antonio Barrera, Eric Morales, they're not really in the conversation in my view, now with Canelo. Marquez, I could potentially see it, but in my view, he's about a level below both of those fighters. Because you have to be remembered, in my view, to be on the level of Canelo or Chavez. You have to be remembered, overall as, at least one of the top fighters, top 5 fighters potentially of your generation. I'm not sure if Marquez is one of the top 5 fighters of his generation. Maybe he is. Maybe he is. He could be up there, but I think that Marquez is a little bit below that of Chavez and Canelo, because you could have a legitimate debate that those guys were the best of their era, or at least, top 3 for sure. I'm not quite sure if you can say that about Marquez, because Floyd and Pacquiao you would definitely have to put over him. You could also debate possibly Andre Ward over Marquez, even though, to be honest with you, that'd be a great debate. But Marquez, in my view, is right there with Mosley, Miguel Cotto, Oscar De La Hoya, possibly slightly above those guys, because of course he did get that win over, that one win over Manny Pacquiao. But in my view, that's where Marquez is. He's right there with Cotto, Sugar Shane Mosley, Oscar De La Hoya. That's where Marquez is, but still an all-time great fighter. Canelo, in my view, is a league above those guys, so we'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much about it. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.